Betrayal. Trust. Redemption. Can Kian and Xara survive the ultimate twist? What if love wasn't just something you feel, but something out there in the stars themselves? Imagine this: you wake up one morning, and there's a message waiting for you. Not from a friend, not from family, but from something that can't possibly be real. From somewhere far beyond your understanding. A love from the stars. Kian thought he knew everything about love until he met Xara. She's not from Earth. She's not like anyone he's ever known. Her eyes, glowing with an intensity that pulls you in, her presence unlike anything human, and the moment they touch, the universe shifts. But what happens when the greatest love of all doesn't come from your heart but from a place so far beyond? It defies all logic. Kian's life was never supposed to be about the stars, the galaxies, or anything the quiet streets of Earth. But one night, his world was turned upside down by a being from a planet far away. Is love truly limitless, even when the heart belongs to someone or something far, far away? But the question is, could a love that crosses galaxies survive? Stay tuned. Because this is only the beginning. As you watch, prepare for the impossible to unfold. This story will ask questions no one dares to answer. And what you'll discover could change everything you believe about love. The stars glittered across the vast emptiness of space. A sudden streak of light cut through the darkness, a spaceship tumbling, spinning helplessly toward the surface of an unknown planet. Inside, the systems failed, alarms blared, everything was chaotic. Kian gripped the control panel, his muscles straining as he tried to steady the ship. But it was useless. The ship crashed with a deafening sound, throwing Kian to the ground. His vision blurred, his body aching, but he remained conscious. The silence was deafening, except for the crackling of burning metal. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her. A figure tall, lithe, standing in the glow of the smoldering wreckage. Her skin glowed faintly, a mesmerizing emerald hue, her purple eyes staring at him with an intensity that took his breath away. She stepped forward. Each movement was fluid, almost ethereal. Her long, platinum hair shimmered under the strange light of the planet. And her ears, sharp and elegant, added to her alien beauty. Kian's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen anything like her. "Who are you?" he managed to say, his voice hoarse from the crash. She tilted her head slightly, as though considering his question. A soft, melodic voice filled his mind. "I am Xara, and you are far from home, Earthling." Kian blinked, disbelief clouding his thoughts. He could feel the weight of her gaze. "You're not from here," he whispered, his words barely forming. A slight smile curved her lips. It was warm, inviting. But her eyes, they held something deep, something ancient. Xara stepped closer, the air between them charged, heavy with tension. "No," she said, her voice softer now. "I am from a place beyond your understanding, beyond your stars." Kian's pulse quickened. His mind raced with questions, with thoughts. But all he could focus on was the strange pull, the connection he felt toward her. Something he couldn't explain. She held out her hand, a graceful gesture. Her fingers glowed faintly, a soft hum vibrating through the air. "I won't harm you," she said. "But you must come with me. You cannot stay here alone." Kian hesitated. Every instinct told him to be cautious, but something inside him urged him to trust her. He took a step forward. Slowly, cautiously. Her smile widened, and as he reached out, the world around them seemed to blur. The tension between them was thick, almost tangible, as if something was about to shift. He finally took her hand. The moment their skin touched, Kian felt a jolt. A rush of energy that coursed through his veins, unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He blinked, disoriented for a moment, before looking up into her eyes again. "You're not human," he said, his voice trembling with awe. Xara's lips curved into a playful smile. "No, but that doesn't matter now." They stood there, facing each other. A human and an alien, connected by fate, by something greater than both of them. The air crackled, the stars above them seemed to pulse, as if the universe itself had shifted, acknowledging their meeting. And for a brief moment, Kian forgot about the crash, forgot about everything except her. Something had changed. Kian couldn't tear his eyes away from her. The energy that coursed between them, it was unlike anything he had ever felt. Xara's presence was magnetic, as if the universe itself had woven them together. She began to walk, her movements graceful and purposeful. "Follow me," she said, and though it was not a command, Kian found himself unable to refuse. The strange pull within him guided his steps. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the trees around them seemed to shimmer, glowing faintly in the dim light. The ground beneath their feet was soft, almost alive, pulsating with the rhythm of something ancient. "What is this place?" Kian asked, his voice barely a whisper. His eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the alien world surrounding him. "This is my home," Xara responded, her tone soft but certain. "A place of balance. Of power." She stopped and turned to him, her eyes glowing brighter in the low light. "A place where energies flow freely." Kian watched as she extended her hand toward a tree. The moment her fingers brushed against the trunk, the tree responded, its leaves shimmering and shifting, as if alive. The energy from her touch was palpable, and Kian felt it even from where he stood. "You can control it," Kian said, astonished. "Not control," she corrected, her voice almost playful. "I merely commune with it." She lowered her hand, and the tree settled. "Everything here is connected. The trees, the air, the water. It all flows as one. And so do I." Kian stood in silence, taking it all in. He had always been a man of science, a man who believed in what could be measured, understood, and controlled. But this was beyond his comprehension. "You're not from Earth," he said slowly, still processing everything. "What are you, really?" Xara turned to face him, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his heart race. "I am a part of this place," she said softly, her voice vibrating with a quiet power. "But I am also from somewhere far beyond your stars. My people, we have traveled through galaxies, seeking knowledge, peace, and understanding." A sharp chill ran down Kian's spine as she spoke. He could feel the weight of her words, the gravity of the knowledge she carried. This wasn't just some alien encounter. This was something deeper, something that might change everything he knew about the universe. She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. "Your planet," she continued, her voice now a mere whisper, "is part of the larger puzzle. You are not alone in this vast expanse, Kian. There are forces far older than you can imagine. And they are coming." Kian's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean? Who's coming?" Xara hesitated, her gaze momentarily distant. The air between them grew thick with unspoken truths. She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, where his heart beat erratically beneath her touch. "The darkness," she said softly. It is already here. It will test everything you know. And it will test us, together. The sensation of her touch lingered on his skin. He felt a warmth, a connection that went beyond words. Kian was no longer just an observer. He was a part of something larger. Something much larger. Xara lowered her hand, and for a moment, their eyes met again. The space between them seemed to grow smaller, more intimate. Kian could feel the heat from her proximity, the pulse of her energy blending with his own. "Are you afraid?" Kian asked quietly, his voice betraying a flicker of uncertainty. Xara's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "Fear is only a momentary feeling," she said. "It is what we do in that moment that matters. Together, we can face anything." Kian's mind raced with 1,000 questions, but when he looked into her eyes, he knew that she was telling the truth. There was a bond between them. A connection that could not be broken. Not by fear. Not by anything. And as he took a step forward, following Xara deeper into the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The beginning of something far greater than he could ever have imagined. The night sky above them seemed to stretch endlessly, the stars twinkling in the cold, foreign air. Kian's breath came in shallow bursts, his heart racing not from the physical strain, but from the presence of the being walking beside him. Xara. Every movement she made seemed to pull at him in ways he couldn't explain. The way the moonlight kissed her skin, the way her purple eyes flickered with a distant, mysterious knowledge. It was as if she wasn't just another creature from another planet, she was something more. Her steps were light, almost graceful, and each time she turned to glance at him, he felt a twinge in his chest. His mind screamed to focus, to understand what was happening, but every glance, every touch of her gaze, seemed to melt his resolve. "You feel it too, don't you?" Kian's voice was barely above a whisper, as if afraid to break the fragile moment that seemed to vibrate between them. Xara paused in her steps, looking back at him. Her eyes softened, a delicate smile curving her lips. "Yes," she replied, her voice a calm, soothing melody that resonated deep within him. "I feel it, Kian. The pull between us." His heart thudded louder in his chest, but this time, it wasn't from fear. It was something else. Something raw, primal. Her words hung in the air between them, thick with the promise of something unknown. They stood there, the distance between them shrinking. It wasn't just the closeness of their bodies, it was the space between their hearts, their minds, their souls. Everything was starting to make sense in ways Kian couldn't articulate. And he didn't need to. "What is it?" he asked, his voice trembling ever so slightly. The connection felt like an electric current coursing through his veins. "Why do I feel this way?" Xara took a step closer, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm, sending a jolt of heat through his body. She leaned in, her voice now a whisper, almost too intimate, too personal. "It is the bond between us. The energy that connects all beings. It is something ancient, something deep." Kian felt her words resonate in his chest. It wasn't just a feeling of attraction. It was a call, a magnetic pull that reached into his very being, awakening something within him that he didn't know existed. Every breath he took seemed to synchronize with hers. Xara reached up and gently touched his cheek, her fingertips barely grazing his skin. His pulse quickened. The warmth of her hand, the soft glow of her skin, the subtle yet undeniable scent that clung to her like an exotic perfume, it was intoxicating. He wanted more. "Xara." Kian's voice caught in his throat. His breath became ragged as he gazed into her eyes, those deep, captivating pools of violet. He could see everything in them: mystery, desire, wisdom, but also something far more dangerous. The weight of it all was too much, and yet it was exactly what he craved. "You don't understand, Kian," she whispered, stepping even closer now, until their bodies were mere inches apart. The air around them seemed to crackle with a newfound intensity. "This connection, it's not just emotional. It's a bond of energy, one that transcends time and space. And it's never happened before, not like this." He could feel the heat radiating from her body now, could sense the energy surging between them. She was a force of nature, something beyond human comprehension. Her lips were so close to his now, so close that he could feel her breath, light and warm against his skin. Without thinking, without knowing what exactly he was doing, Kian closed the gap between them. Their lips met gently at first, an experiment of sorts, a question without words. But it didn't take long for the kiss to deepen. The energy that flowed through their bodies exploded, surging through him like an electric current, spreading warmth from his chest to his fingertips. Xara's hands came up to rest on his shoulders, her touch electric, pulling him closer, her body pressed against his. He could feel every curve of her body, every movement she made. There was no hesitation now. Everything that had been left unspoken, all the questions, the doubts, the fear, it melted away in that single moment of contact. She pulled back, just slightly, her eyes wide, filled with an emotion Kian couldn't name. "We should stop," she said, her voice quiet but thick with something he couldn't quite place. Kian, breathing heavily, shook his head. "No. I can't. I can't stop." He touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, the smoothness of her skin. "I don't want to." Xara's smile softened, but there was something almost sad in her eyes now. "You should, Kian. This connection, it's dangerous. It will pull us into something we cannot control." But even as she spoke, Kian could see the hesitation in her eyes, the conflict within her. She wanted this too. They both did. And then, without another word, she kissed him again. The air around them hummed with a strange energy, the world seemingly holding its breath as Kian and Xara stood locked in an embrace that felt like the universe itself had paused to witness their connection. But beneath the electric intensity of their kiss, a feeling of unease began to settle in Kian's chest. He could feel it, the weight of what this all meant. His heart raced, but his mind couldn't shake the storm of doubts and questions. "We can't keep doing this," Xara murmured against his lips, her voice thick with conflicted emotions. She pulled back slightly, but not enough to break the connection. Her eyes were searching his face, as if trying to gauge his every thought. "This, whatever this is, it's more than just a bond. It's a force that will tear us apart if we're not careful." Kian couldn't bring himself to look away from her. Her words struck him deep, but the pull was undeniable. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something that echoed in the very core of who he was. He felt alive, truly alive, in a way he'd never known. "I don't care," he said, his voice steady but filled with an intensity that made Xara's breath catch in her throat. "I've never felt anything like this before. Not with anyone." He placed his hand gently on her cheek, his thumb brushing the smoothness of her skin. "We can't stop now, Xara. Not when we're this close to understanding it." Xara closed her eyes for a brief moment, her breath shaky. "You don't understand. If we continue down this path, it will consume both of us. It will tear apart not just our worlds, but our very souls." His fingers slid through her hair, the silken strands slipping through his hands like water. "Then let it consume me," he whispered, his heart hammering in his chest. "If it means being with you, then let it consume me." The silence between them felt heavy, charged. Xara's eyes softened for a moment, as if she were considering his words, really considering them. But then, just as quickly, her expression hardened. "You don't understand the magnitude of this," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I am not like you. My existence is tied to something far greater than just this moment. I'm here for a reason: your planet, your people, your future. It's all tied to what we share, Kian. What we could become. But I don't know if I can protect you from what's to come." Kian stepped back, the weight of her words sinking in. The atmosphere between them grew thick with the realization that this wasn't just a love story, this was something much more complicated. Much more dangerous. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice low and filled with a mix of hope and fear. "What are we supposed to do if we can't stop this? If we can't stop us?" Xara hesitated for a moment, her gaze shifting to the distant horizon, where the alien landscape stretched endlessly before them. The trees swayed gently, the glowing light of distant stars casting an ethereal glow across the land. For a moment, Kian thought she might say something, but then she shook her head. "We can't go back, Kian," she whispered, barely audible. "But there is something coming. A force, a power that will stop at nothing to destroy everything we know. And it's connected to us. To what we've just started. What we must do, is prepare for it." The gravity of her words hit him like a ton of bricks. The tender intimacy they had shared just moments ago seemed like a distant memory, replaced now with a looming, terrifying truth. There was something out there, something bigger than them both, and it was coming for them. Kian looked at her, the realization settling in. This wasn't just a moment of passion, it was a turning point, a choice. They had both crossed a line, and now they had to face the consequences of their decisions. "Then we fight," Kian said, his voice firm and resolute. He reached out, his hand finding hers once again, feeling the cool energy pulse through him as their fingers entwined. "We face it together. No matter what happens." Xara looked at him, her gaze softening, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something beyond the struggle. Something she had never dared to hope for. She squeezed his hand tightly. "Together," she agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Together." But deep inside, Xara knew that the path they were on would not be an easy one. The darkness she spoke of, the force that threatened everything they knew, was already stirring in the shadows. And now, they had no choice but to face it head-on and perhaps, to lose themselves in the process. The days passed in a blur of uncertainty. Kian and Xara continued their journey, venturing deeper into the heart of the alien planet. Despite the pull they felt toward each other, an invisible wall seemed to rise between them. Xara remained distant, her mind occupied with something far more troubling than the growing connection between them. They had arrived at a vast temple-like structure, a ruin of an ancient civilization, its walls etched with intricate symbols and alien designs that seemed to pulse with hidden power. Xara had been here before. She had come to this place many times, searching for answers, but each visit left her with more questions. As they entered the temple, the air around them grew heavier, the atmosphere thick with mystery. The walls seemed to hum with energy, and Kian could feel it too, an ancient, lingering presence. Xara's eyes scanned the carvings on the walls, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This place, it holds the answers we need." Her voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something unseen. Kian moved closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "What are we looking for?" His voice sounded small in the vast emptiness of the temple. "What is this place?" Xara turned to him, her gaze intense, her lips parted as if she were about to reveal something of great importance. "This is the heart of the power I told you about. The power that binds us, and the power that is threatening everything. My people were once guardians of this energy, but we lost control. Something is awakening, something dark. And it's connected to the bond between us, Kian." The weight of her words settled in, and for a moment, Kian stood there, unable to move. He had known this was more than just a simple love story, but now, the truth felt even more overwhelming than he had imagined. "So, what does that mean?" Kian asked, his voice shaky. "What exactly is it that's coming for us?" Xara's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Kian saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, something she rarely showed. "It's called the Shadow. A being older than anything you can comprehend. It seeks to destroy what it cannot control. And it's coming for us because of the energy we share." Kian felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he processed her words. "And what does this have to do with me?" "With us." Xara stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. She reached out, gently cupping his face in her hands. The moment her skin touched his, he could feel the familiar electric charge, the bond between them pulsing with raw energy. "You are not just any human, Kian. You have a part to play in this. Your energy, your essence, it's tied to the fate of this universe, just as mine is. We are bound by something greater than either of us. The Shadow knows this, and it seeks to break the connection we share." Kian swallowed hard, trying to steady his racing heart. "And what happens if it succeeds?" His voice trembled as he asked the question he dreaded most. Xara's face darkened, and her eyes flickered with pain. "If the Shadow breaks our bond, everything will fall into chaos. This world, your world, everything, will be consumed by darkness. The universe itself will unravel." Kian felt his chest tighten. He could barely process the weight of her words. Everything they had been through, everything that had drawn them together, now felt like the calm before a storm. "Then we fight," he said, his voice firm. "We have to fight it, right?" Xara nodded, her eyes softening slightly. "Yes. But not just with weapons or strength. This is a fight for our souls. We must face the darkness inside ourselves first. Only then can we stand a chance." Kian looked down at her hands still resting on his face, feeling the heat of her touch. The warmth and safety that had once been a comfort now felt like a warning. Their bond wasn't just a connection, it was a responsibility, a weight he hadn't fully understood until now. As the truth sank in, a deep sense of determination rose within him. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for her. For them. For the universe itself. Xara stepped back, her face set with resolve. "The time to prepare is running out. We must face what's coming, together." Kian nodded, his pulse steadying. He had no idea what awaited them, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't turn back now. "Then let's do it," he said, a sense of purpose filling him. "Together." And with that, they turned toward the center of the temple, where the heart of the power, the key to their survival, awaited. The path ahead would be perilous, but with the bond they shared, Kian knew they were ready to face whatever came next. The cold wind swept through the ruins of the ancient temple, the air thick with a sense of urgency and anticipation. Kian and Xara stood side by side, their minds racing, each lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. The shadows of the past hung heavy over them, but they couldn't afford to dwell on what had come before. The time for answers had passed, the time for action was now. As they stepped forward, deeper into the heart of the temple, the very ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate with an unseen force. The walls glowed faintly, the ancient symbols etched into the stone pulsing with energy. Kian couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. He wasn't just an earthling now, he was part of something much larger than himself. "Are you ready?" Xara's voice broke the silence, her eyes flickering with a quiet intensity. Kian looked at her, the determination in her gaze reflected in his own. "As ready as I'll ever be." Xara nodded, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. She had come a long way since they first met. The warrior, the protector now, she was a guide. But that guide was uncertain too. She was not just leading Kian through the unknown, she was leading herself. "We may not have a choice," she added, turning back toward the depths of the temple. "But we are not alone in this fight." Kian furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" Xara motioned to the shadows in the distance. From the darkness emerged another figure, one that Kian couldn't quite make out at first. But as the figure stepped into the light, his eyes widened in recognition. It was Zen, the creature who had once been their enemy, the one who had almost torn them apart in the early days of their journey. But now, Zen's presence was different. The malevolent energy that had once surrounded him was gone. In its place was something else, something Kian couldn't quite place. Zen's eyes met Kian's, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, Zen spoke, his voice rough, but sincere. "I know what you're thinking. I'm not the same anymore." Xara stepped forward, standing beside Zen. "He has changed. His mind was corrupted by the forces we're fighting against, but now, he's an ally." Kian stared at them both, trying to process what was happening. Zen had been an enemy, someone he couldn't trust. But here he was, standing beside Xara, ready to fight the same battle they were about to face. "What changed?" Kian asked, his voice filled with suspicion, but also curiosity. Zen looked down, his expression hardening. "The shadow's influence, it manipulates, twists the mind. I was a pawn. But when I saw the truth about what we were fighting for, I couldn't ignore it anymore." He glanced at Xara, then back at Kian. "I made a choice." Xara nodded, her voice low. "We all make choices. And now we have to trust him. The fate of this world depends on it." Kian hesitated for a moment, still unsure whether to trust Zen, but the sense of unity between the three of them was undeniable. They had to work together. No one could afford to stand alone. "Then we fight," Kian said, his voice firm, the weight of his decision settling over him. "But know this, if you betray us, I'll make sure you regret it." Zen didn't flinch. He simply nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I won't betray you." Xara stepped forward, placing her hand on Kian's arm. "Together, we stand. And together, we'll defeat the darkness." As the three of them stood there, side by side, Kian could feel the weight of their alliance settling into place. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about something much bigger than the individuals standing in the temple. They were about to face the shadow, the force that threatened not only their worlds but the entire universe. And with their newfound alliance, Kian, Xara, and Zen would need to confront the darkness head-on, pushing their physical and emotional limits. But in that moment, standing in the heart of the ancient temple, surrounded by the energy of the past and the present, Kian felt something he hadn't expected to feel: hope. They might not know what was coming. They might not know how they would defeat the shadow. But they knew one thing for sure: they would face it together. The moonlight poured down in silvery waves, illuminating the jungle-like terrain that stretched out before them. The night was quiet, save for the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional hum of distant alien creatures. But the quiet wasn't peaceful, it was thick with anticipation. The journey ahead was uncertain, and the bond between Kian and Xara was growing in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. The temple was now behind them, their brief alliance with Zen securing them the knowledge they needed for what lay ahead. But as the hours wore on, the weight of the mission started to settle into Kian's bones. This was no longer just a fight for survival, it was a test of something far deeper. He glanced over at Xara, her profile illuminated by the soft light of their campfire. Her presence had become more than just an enigma to him. It was more than the strength she wielded, or the mystery of her origins. It was the way she made him feel, the way she made him want. There was an undeniable pull toward her, something that both excited and frightened him. And with each passing moment, it grew harder to ignore. "Xara," Kian began, his voice rough, a reflection of the struggle he felt inside. He was torn between wanting to reach out to her, and the fear of what it might mean for them both. "Do you ever wonder if we're making the right choice?" She turned to look at him, her violet eyes glowing softly in the dim light. There was a quiet sadness in them, a depth of understanding that made Kian's heart tighten. "Every choice has its consequences," she replied, her voice calm yet laden with unspoken weight. "But some choices are inevitable. We don't have the luxury of hesitation anymore." Kian nodded, though he couldn't shake the lingering doubt. "I don't want to lose myself in this, in you." For a moment, Xara was silent, her gaze fixed on him. There was a pause, a moment where time itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, almost imperceptibly, she moved closer. She reached out, her cool fingers brushing against his, sending a shock of warmth through him. The contact was gentle, but it carried with it a weight that Kian couldn't ignore. It wasn't just a touch, it was a promise. "You won't lose yourself, Kian," she said softly, her voice a whisper against the night. "But I can't promise the same for me." Kian's heart raced as her words hit him with an unexpected force. Her honesty, her vulnerability, it was something he hadn't expected. But it only pulled him closer, deeper into the storm of emotions that were rising between them. Without thinking, Kian cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently tracing the curve of her cheek. Her skin was warm, though different from the warmth he had always known. It was electric, full of life and energy, as though she carried the heartbeat of a whole universe within her. The air around them shifted. It was no longer just the quiet of the night or the murmur of distant creatures. It was them, their energy, their bond, vibrating in the air. Their hearts beat in unison, and for a brief moment, Kian felt like nothing else existed but the two of them. His lips found hers, gently at first, a soft exploration. Xara didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her hands finding his chest, pressing against him as though anchoring herself in this moment. The kiss deepened, a dance of warmth and energy that took them both by surprise. Xara's touch was almost magnetic, her fingers tracing the lines of his muscles, the heat of her skin against his, the way she responded to his every move. Her breath, quick and shallow, mingled with his, a steady rhythm that spoke volumes of their shared desire, their shared need. It wasn't just physical, it was more than that. It was a merging of energies, of souls intertwined by something far greater than mere attraction. They had always been bound by fate, but now, now it was something they were choosing to fight for. Together. The kiss broke for a moment, but the connection between them didn't waver. Xara's eyes searched his, and Kian could see the vulnerability in her gaze. "You're right," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "This is more than we thought. And it will change everything." Kian didn't respond with words. Instead, he leaned in again, his lips capturing hers in a deeper, more urgent kiss. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but in that moment, all that mattered was the undeniable connection between them, the warmth, the energy, the electricity that neither of them could deny. Together, they could face anything. But the truth was, he didn't want to face it without her. The stars above were distant, cold, almost indifferent to the tumult unfolding on the planet below. As Kian and Xara sat in silence beneath the flickering glow of the campfire, the weight of their choices seemed to settle over them like a heavy fog. Kian could feel it pressing in from all sides, suffocating him. The connection between him and Xara had only grown stronger, but now, in the quiet aftermath of their shared intimacy, the reality of their situation began to overwhelm him. Xara sat beside him, her gaze lost in the flames, her thoughts distant. There was a quiet sadness in her posture, a burden that Kian could feel but not fully understand. He reached out, hesitating just for a moment before touching her hand, gently resting his fingers on hers. "What's wrong?" Kian's voice was low, the tension in the air thick with unspoken words. Xara sighed, a soft exhale that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 fears. "I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid that this connection, this bond, will lead us into something neither of us is ready for." Kian's heart tightened at the words. He had never seen Xara so vulnerable, so exposed. The powerful, confident being who had led him through this strange world now seemed uncertain, fragile even. "I'm afraid too," Kian admitted quietly. "Afraid that we're moving too fast. Afraid that this, whatever this is, it's consuming us." There was a long pause as they sat together, each lost in their own thoughts. Kian's mind raced. He had never been in a situation like this before. His emotions were tangled: desire, fear, confusion, longing. Everything was coming at him all at once, and it was hard to separate the truth from the noise. He couldn't deny the pull he felt towards Xara. Every fiber of his being ached for her, wanted her, needed her. But at the same time, a part of him feared what that would mean for them both. He wasn't sure he was ready to give up everything he had known for something so unknown. "What if we're not enough?" Xara's voice cut through his thoughts, her words raw with emotion. "What if this bond isn't enough to save us from the shadow?" Her question hit Kian hard. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her everything would be fine, that they would find a way. But deep down, he knew the truth. The fight they were facing wasn't just physical, it was a battle of the soul. It was about more than their desire for each other. It was about whether they could overcome the forces that sought to tear them apart, not just as individuals, but as a united force. "I don't know," Kian said honestly, his voice shaky with vulnerability. "But what I do know is this: I can't imagine facing this without you. You've shown me a side of myself I didn't even know existed. And I can't turn away from that now." Xara turned to him, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet intensity. For a long moment, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire between them, the silence stretching out as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, Xara reached out, cupping Kian's face in her cool hands. "Then we fight," she whispered, her voice full of quiet resolve. "We fight with everything we have. Not just for ourselves, but for what we've built together. Kian leaned into her touch, feeling the coolness of her hands against his heated skin. The touch was comforting, grounding him in this chaos. Her eyes were filled with determination, but there was something else too, a vulnerability, a fear of loss. It mirrored his own. Together, Kian whispered back, his heart swelling with a new understanding. Whatever was to come, they would face it side by side. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other. But just as the tension between them seemed to resolve, a distant, haunting sound echoed through the night, something far too familiar. Kian's breath caught in his throat. What was that? Xara's expression hardened. She stood up quickly, her eyes scanning the horizon. The shadow, it's coming. Kian's heart raced. How do you know? I can feel it. Her voice was cold now, and Kian could see the change in her demeanor. She wasn't the same person who had just shared that moment with him. She had become a warrior again, focused, determined. We need to move. Now. With no time to waste, Xara turned, and began walking quickly toward the dense forest, her form moving with purpose. Kian followed, adrenaline pumping through his veins. His heart still pounded, but now it wasn't just because of the intimacy they had shared, it was because he felt the weight of what was to come. The world around them seemed to shift, the energy in the air growing thick with tension. They weren't just running from something, they were preparing to face it. Kian caught up to her, matching her pace. Xara, he said, his voice urgent. We're ready, right? We can do this. For a moment, Xara didn't answer. Her eyes were distant, scanning the horizon, as if she could feel the very heartbeat of the universe itself. Then, she glanced back at Kian, and for the briefest moment, their gazes locked. We will be. Her voice was steady, but there was a fierce determination in her eyes that left no room for doubt. The moment of vulnerability they had shared was over. It was replaced by something stronger, a shared resolve, a united front against the unknown. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for each other. And as they entered the dark, foreboding forest together, the path ahead felt uncertain, but it was a path they would walk together. The forest stretched out before them, dark and unfamiliar, the shadows of alien trees looming like sentinels in the night. The distant hum of unseen creatures filled the air, but there was an overwhelming silence between Kian and Xara. Both of them knew the battle ahead would test everything they had, physically and emotionally. But neither of them said a word as they moved through the thick underbrush. Their bond, their shared connection, was now a silent understanding. Kian's mind raced, but there was no time to think. The distant rumble in the air, a low, almost imperceptible sound, grew louder, reverberating through the ground beneath them. The shadow was near. Xara stopped abruptly, her hand raising to signal Kian to stay quiet. Her eyes flickered to the sky, where the first hints of an ominous storm cloud were beginning to form. It's here, she whispered, her voice taut with anticipation. Kian's pulse quickened. He could feel it too, the air was charged, the energy in the atmosphere building as if something massive was about to break free. He stepped closer to Xara, standing just a few feet behind her, ready to move at her command. We need to split up, Xara said suddenly, her voice sharp with authority. You take the left flank. I'll handle the right. If we're to defeat this thing, we need to approach it from different angles. Together, but apart. Kian's eyes widened. Are you sure? We can't afford to. We don't have a choice. Her eyes met his, filled with a quiet determination that only fueled his own resolve. We've already crossed the line. There's no going back now. Before he could protest, she was already moving, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. Kian gritted his teeth, the weight of their situation pressing down on him, but there was no hesitation now. He knew what they had to do. He sprinted forward, using the thick trees for cover, his heart pounding in his chest. The forest seemed to close in on him, but he pushed forward, adrenaline coursing through his veins. His thoughts drifted briefly to Xara, what she had said, the vulnerability she'd shown. It only made him more determined to protect her. To protect what they had started. And then, the ground shook beneath him. A crack of energy shot through the air, and Kian's body went rigid. A massive figure emerged from the trees, its dark form shrouded in an unnatural mist, its eyes glowing with an eerie red light. The shadow. The very thing that threatened everything they had built. Kian's breath caught. "You've come for us," he muttered, his voice steady but filled with anger. "Well, I'm not going down without a fight." The creature let out a low growl, its form shifting and writhing in the dark, as though the very fabric of reality bent around it. It moved toward him with terrifying speed, its limbs elongating as it reached out to grab him. Kian barely managed to dodge, the creature's claws tearing through the air where he had been just a moment ago. The fight had begun. Kian quickly drew a weapon from his suit, a high-tech energy blade designed for combat. As he swung it at the shadow, the blade crackled with energy, but the creature seemed unaffected. It shifted again, and the blade passed harmlessly through its smoky body. Kian cursed under his breath, realizing this wasn't a battle of strength alone. He needed Xara. But she was out there, somewhere in the chaos, fighting her own battle. And he had no time to wait. The creature lunged at him again, and this time, Kian met it head on. He dodged and slashed, narrowly avoiding its grip. "Come on, you bastard," he yelled, sweat beading on his forehead as the creature kept coming. He needed to buy time for Xara to do her part. Meanwhile, across the battlefield, Xara wasn't far away. She was locked in her own struggle, facing a different manifestation of the shadow, one that seemed to be almost a reflection of her. It was as if the shadow sought to use her own energy against her. "You think you can control me?" Xara hissed, her voice icy and filled with power. The energy around her seemed to shift as she called upon the power of the planet, drawing on its ancient forces. Her hands crackled with electricity, her eyes glowing brightly. But even with her immense power, the shadow kept pushing her back. "I won't let you win," she growled, her voice a fierce promise. The battle was reaching its peak. Back with Kian, he could feel the weight of the fight wearing him down, his energy waning. The shadow was relentless, its form a living nightmare, a mass of swirling darkness that seemed to feed off the very energy of his body. His sword could barely cut through its ethereal form. Then, he saw it, a small opening in its defense. The shadow's form flickered for just a moment, a crack in its near-invincible armor. Without thinking, Kian lunged forward, driving his blade into the heart of the creature's dark mass. The energy from the blade surged through the creature, its form shaking violently. Kian stepped back, breathless, watching as the shadow let out a blood-curdling screech before beginning to dissipate into thin air. "It's not over," Kian muttered, his voice strained. "But it's a start." From across the field, he heard Xara's voice, steady but filled with strength. "Kian, we're not finished yet." With a final, resolute move, Xara unleashed the full force of her energy, bringing her power to bear on the remaining pieces of the shadow. The ground trembled as the battle reached its climax, and the air grew thick with the final rush of their combined forces. The shadow's remnants flickered out of existence, fading into nothingness. As the dust settled and the smoke cleared, Kian collapsed to the ground, his body exhausted, but his spirit alight. Xara approached him, her face still focused, but there was a sense of relief in her eyes. She offered him a hand, and as he took it, he pulled himself to his feet. They had done it. They had faced the darkness together and they had won. "We did it," Kian said breathlessly, the words barely escaping his lips. Xara nodded, but there was something in her eyes, something unreadable, as if she knew the fight wasn't truly over. "Yes. But this is just the beginning." And as they stood together, looking out over the battlefield, Kian felt the weight of her words. They had broken through the boundaries of fear, of uncertainty. But there was much more to come, and the road ahead was still uncertain. But whatever happened, they would face it together. The battlefield lay in silence. The eerie hum of energy that had filled the air moments before was now replaced by an unsettling quiet, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Kian stood beside Xara, his body still trembling from the intense battle they had just fought. The shadow was gone, its malevolent presence banished for now, but the aftermath still lingered, heavy in the air between them. Kian's chest rose and fell in deep breaths, his mind still reeling from the fight. He glanced at Xara, who stood motionless beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon, her expression unreadable. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. There was more to come. But for now, they had won. Together. Xara's voice broke the silence. "We did what we had to do," she said softly, her gaze softening as she looked at him. Her usual calm demeanor had shifted, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and something deeper. Something Kian hadn't seen before. He took a step closer to her. "I'm not sure I'll ever fully understand everything that just happened, but I know this, I couldn't have done it without you." Xara didn't respond immediately. She reached out, her fingers lightly brushing his arm, sending a rush of warmth through him. "You don't have to understand it all," she said quietly, her voice tinged with a vulnerability that was rare for her. "But I'm glad you're here." Kian's heart fluttered, but it wasn't the adrenaline from the fight, it was something more. Something real. He had never thought of himself as a hero, but standing beside Xara, sharing this moment with her, made him feel like he could be. "I don't know what happens next," Kian said, his voice low, barely a whisper. He took her hand in his, the touch light but full of meaning. "But I know I can't lose you. Not now. Not after everything we've been through." Xara's gaze softened, and she stepped closer, her body pressing against his in the stillness of the night. "You won't lose me, Kian," she whispered, her voice filled with an emotion he couldn't quite decipher. Her hand cupped his face, her touch gentle yet firm, as if grounding him in that moment. "I've already lost so much, but I won't lose you. Not when I've finally found something worth fighting for." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Kian's breath caught in his throat as he gazed into her eyes, feeling the unspoken bond between them grow stronger with each passing second. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper. Something that transcended time, space, and even the universe itself. He leaned in slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. As his lips met hers, the world seemed to disappear. There was no shadow, no threat, no looming danger. There was only the warmth of her kiss, the taste of her lips, and the undeniable pull that had drawn them together from the very beginning. Their kiss deepened, slower now, as if they had all the time in the world. Kian felt the weight of the universe in that moment, but it wasn't a burden. It was a connection. A bond that transcended all logic and reason. They were connected in ways that defied explanation, and for the first time, Kian truly understood that no matter what happened next, nothing could break them apart. When they finally pulled away, Kian was breathless, his mind still trying to process what had just happened. His gaze lingered on Xara, her face flushed, her eyes still locked on his. "What does this mean?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, as though afraid to speak too loudly in the quiet aftermath of their kiss. Xara's smile was soft, almost sad, but there was a strength in it, a quiet strength that he admired. "It means we're no longer just two separate beings," she replied, her voice filled with emotion. "We're something more now. Something that can't be undone." Kian's heart swelled with understanding. She was right. They weren't just two people from different worlds anymore. They were connected by something deeper, by love, by fate, and by the battles they had fought together. He took her hand in his again, his grip firm and unyielding. "Then let's face it all together. Whatever comes next. No matter the cost." Xara nodded, her gaze never leaving his. Together. And as they stood there, the distant stars above them shimmering in the dark sky, Kian realized that this was what he had been searching for all along. A love beyond the stars. A love that had the power to transcend time, space, and even the greatest dangers they would face. For the first time, he felt truly alive. And no matter what challenges awaited them, they would face them together. Side by side. Always. The stars had never felt this close. As Kian and Xara stood, their hands intertwined, their gazes fixed on the vastness of the universe, one undeniable truth settled between them: this was no longer just a love story. They had crossed the boundaries of space, of time, of understanding. And yet, the forces that sought to tear them apart, forces beyond even the stars, had not finished their pursuit. "This isn't over, is it?" Kian whispered, his voice filled with both wonder and fear. Xara turned to him, a smile that could light up the darkest corners of the universe on her lips. "No, Kian. It's just begun." They had fought, they had loved, and they had survived the impossible. But the universe was vast, far larger than they could ever imagine. And as they stood there, holding onto each other, the question remained: can love truly transcend the stars? Because the universe doesn't stop. And neither does their love. But where does it go next? And here's where you come in. What if this story isn't just about them? What if it's about all of us, searching for something beyond our world, beyond ourselves? Can we, too, find a love like theirs? What do you think? Can love really exist beyond our wildest dreams, beyond the stars? You've just seen the beginning. Hit that subscribe button and join us. Let's explore the galaxies of the heart together. You're part of something extraordinary now, and the journey has only just begun. Comment your thoughts below and join the first 1000 to see where the story will take us next.